Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Your Corporate Strategy, Navigating Risk and Governance, part of our Professional Services series. My name is Sam Sakasiris. I'm the National Membership Team Leader at Austmine, and I'll be your host today. Before we begin, on behalf of Austmine and our presenting companies, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we all meet today and recognise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending this webinar. This webinar series is designed to connect our members and stakeholders with leading professionals who can provide valuable insights across various business disciplines. Today, we continue the series with Your Corporate Strategy, Navigating Risk and Governance. You can learn from industry experts as they share methodologies and strategies to safeguard business continuity, strengthen leadership, and enhance corporate performance. The format of today's webinar consists of a short presentation by each of our member presenters, followed by a Q&A session. If you have a question for any of the presenters throughout the webinar, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If your question is directed to a specific presenter, please note their name in your question. Just for your information, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for an on-demand viewing. Joining us today, we have representatives of two leading member companies who will share insights into effective crisis management, risk assessment frameworks, and governance structures that support strategic decision-making in critical times. Today's presenters are Laura Toscano from SW Accountants and Advisors and Craig Hook from Strategic Intent Consulting. That concludes the welcome and introductions. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first presenter, Laura Toscano, Director Assurance and Advisory Services from SW Accountants and Advisors.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for that welcome. And yeah, I'm Laura. I'm a Director at SW Accountants and Advisors. So I specialise in internal audit and risk management services. And the overview of my presentation, I'm going to talk to the effective governance and risk management. I have a bit of an overview, what is governance and risk management, and then I wanted to cover some of the key areas. So things such as board structure and operation, strategy planning and monitoring, risk management processes, internal controls framework, assurance framework, and risk culture. So my experience is across quite a broad range of industries, and I've have experience in things like development of governance, risk management frameworks, developing policies and procedures, and then as part of internal audit work, that involves quite a lot of design and operating effectiveness of control processes. So just a bit of a disclaimer, some of what I'm saying is, might be better practice, might be more generalized recommendations. It doesn't mean that it is something specifically that your entity may need to do, but you may need to get specific advice tailored for your organization, but I'm just providing a bit of a background overview of some of the better practice recommendations. And when we talk about governance and risk management, we're talking about the processes, systems and processes to direct and manage the affairs of the business. So things, good governance can contribute to financial stability, the business profitability. It's things such as risk oversight, risk management, internal controls. So you should have good systems and processes set up around reliable financial reporting, compliance with laws and regulation. This will help minimize risks such as fraudulent behavior. It's also helping protect the reputation of the organization. So at a high level, if there is a board, that role should be outlined in a board charter. So board will be responsible for things such as strategic, financial, and operating plans, things such as major capital expenditure, major corporate transactions, approving financial reports, establishing procedures. They'd have a role in appointing and managing the performance of the CEO, and things such as succession plans for senior executives. And the corporate governance, where the board is in place, the corporate governance should include things like a risk management framework, internal controls, and compliance processes. So the board might set up a committee. For example, you might see an audit committee. So that might support the board in things like financial reporting and the accounting and internal controls. But if a committee is set up, that that should be documented in a charter. It should clearly set out the role, responsibility, and scope of the committee, and that should be then maybe a summary reported up to the board. Another example might be a remuneration committee that the board sets up in terms of setting up the systems of remuneration and things like review of the performance of the CEO. So things that are quite important would be things, directors being given sufficient background and information to assist them in fulfilling their duties, submitting for re-election, having access to relevant and timely information, and then also considering the business environment and activities. And then also ensuring that all legislation regulations, that there's processes set up to comply with those, any relevant legislation and regulations. So examples might be maybe OH&S or environmental requirements. And if the directors don't have relevant expertise, that might be where they need to seek external specialists. And in some cases, the recommendation would be that the majority of the directors are independent, but you also need to consider the nature of, is it a listed entity? Is it private? But probably for large listed entities, the recommendation would be majority independent directors. So having things such as a business plan covering key strategies, that will help help the organization to deliver the services. So the board would also be expected to receive reports, so comparing financial performance to budgeted financial targets. There should be measures to determine if it's achieving that set out vision. There should also be strategies and plans set up. So things such as key objectives, performance measures, and these should link back to the strategic objectives. So the goal would be that if there's variances between planned and actual, that there can be corrective action undertaken. So talking a bit about the risk management processes. So this is quite important to set up a risk management framework. So the risk appetite would be set by the board. So this gives an indication of the tolerance levels and the expected, the level of the risk that the entity is willing to accept, and that should align with the strategic objectives. So there is a risk management standard, ISO 27001, and that sets out a very clear risk methodology. So that can be used to help set up a process, and you need to be identifying risks, evaluating risks, setting up controls, monitoring, and then establishing risk treatment plans. So it may depend on the nature and the size of your business, but probably cyber would be an example that impacts pretty much every entity. So that could be something that, ransomware might be identified as a risk, but then what is the process you've established to assess the likelihood and consequence of that as a risk to your entity, and what is the process you're then setting up to monitor that, and then having reporting around those risks. So it's also important to think about the financial and non-financial risks, and also that there's clear roles and responsibility for any risk management, and that there's training provided to relevant staff. So internal controls, that's probably where a lot of my work is in terms of often what we would do is provide independent reporting to an audit committee as an internal auditor, but having that set up internal controls is really important to have proper management and oversight. So things such as having an organisation structure with clear position descriptions, setting up policies and procedures. So there should be financial controls established, things such as code of conduct, procedures for conflicts of interest. So when if we're saying things like what is a financial control, so it could be that you might have bank reconciliations or things, access to certain financial information is restricted, procedures to follow up, um, when, payments for accounts payable, that there's authorization required so that, there's not, the potential for fraud. So it's that sort of thing. Another thing would be to consider things such as segregation of duties. So that's harder in a smaller entity, but for, larger entities, considering where you can separate functions. So things such as initiating, authorizing, recording and reconciling transactions and having authorization and approval processes. Another thing to consider is things such as whistleblower policies. So, if there's issues that are identified, that there's some method to escalate that. So ASIC has got a regulatory guide 270 on whistleblower policies, so that can provide guidance around establishing a whistleblower policy. And some of the other things would be, insurance coverage. You'd want to have appropriate frameworks in place for any health and safety legislation that you need to comply with, monitoring any laws, any regulations around health and safety. So it's really just setting up the frameworks for, awareness of your requirements, making sure that, any changes that's being monitored, and then processes set up to manage these. And then another area is around business continuity, disaster recovery. So, that's quite important to ensure that you have tested a business continuity plan in the event that it needs to be used, and things such as backups. So even just thinking about maintaining relationships with key stakeholders, that's also important. Assurance framework, this is things like setting up, self-assessments. You can also have an external auditor if it's applicable in terms of assurance over the financial statements, and then an internal audit function. And the final area is just, risk culture has become more of more importance. So, things such as you can perform a risk culture survey. So that can help you understand, things around leadership, if there's clear messages from leaders, if people understand the level of risk that they can take in their role, if the risk management is part of core decision making, if people feel that they can constructively challenge decisions. So that was a very high level summary of what I wanted to cover. Happy to take questions after the next presentation, but yeah, thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Flora. Some great insights there into governance and risk management. I'll now hand over to our next presenter, which is Craig Hook, Director of Strategic Intent Consulting.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about advisory models and what might be an appropriate model for you to help your business grow. So firstly, a little bit about me. I'm a strategic advisor working with business owners, boards and executives, primarily with private and family businesses, but businesses of all types. That's been honed over 30 years experience internationally executive roles with mining companies and mine consultancies, also previous partner in a management consulting firm, and these days sitting as an advisory board chair across a variety of different businesses, METS businesses, professional services, and advanced manufacturing. Also do a bit of mentoring with some startups, including the Austmine program and Core Innovation Hub here in Perth. So why do we want to think about our advisory model? Well, Laura's done a great job explaining some of the mechanics and some of the risks areas around governance. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit more about some of the strategies on getting external advisors into your business. As your business grows, certainly your governance structure and your decision-making capability should also change. Perhaps some of these things on the screen you've seen before. Private equity group has a small interest in your business, a couple of seats on the board, and causing some hassles. How do you manage that? You might have families and friends investing in the business, and they're probably wondering when are they going to get their money back? And of course, you're just trying to build a great business. So when I talk about a fit for purpose advisory board, what do I actually mean? So if we look at the diagram at the top there, we move from left to right. As your business gets more complex and you really focus on those strategic opportunities, you'll start to formalize your advisory structure. You'll move away from families and friends and networking groups. And at some point, you'll be formalizing your governance board, or perhaps you'll look at an advisory board. At the bottom of the picture there, describes some of the different models that you could have for an advisory board. Again, can be quite informal, all the way through to project advisory boards or an advisory board working alongside your governance board. Now, of course, this raises probably an obvious question, which is, well, what's the difference between a governance board and an advisory board? Well, there's pretty much only one simple difference. A governance board has statutory obligations to make decisions on behalf of all shareholders. An advisory board, on the other hand, simply makes recommendations. The people that sit on an advisory board and the people that sit on a governance board are pretty much the same people. They're experts, they're experienced, and they open doors for you. But the very simple difference is an advisory board only makes recommendations, whereas your governance board, even if it's just you still retain that decision-making ability. Let's talk about what an advisory board means. You may or may not be familiar with that. As I said, it makes recommendations. And in the majority of cases, people look to an advisory board when they're looking for market intelligence. Typically, when you're looking to go into a new market or a new geography, you're having advisors around the table. They all won't agree. They'll bring a diversity of opinion. They help with your critical thinking. And by nature, because they're very flexible, you can have them focused across your business or on specific issues for a long term or just for a very short term. So very flexible in nature, but really, as a business owner, a great way to get strategic insights to those opportunities or perhaps issues that you're dealing with. So let's talk about some of the different types of advisory boards. Well, the first one is what I call an advisory board for the business sector, typically startups or scale-ups where it might be just you and your founder. You don't really have a mature governance board structure. So essentially, you put a board of advisors together to help you with some of those key strategic questions. The second type of advisory board, which is probably the most common one, is a project advisory board. And that can be for any business of any size, anytime, anywhere, on any topic. And typically, they'll focus on something over a 3 to 18-month time period, such as you might be thinking about expanding into the US. Should I set up an entity, a distributorship? What sort of model? So that might be a great example of how to use a project advisory board. The third type of advisory board is one that sits alongside your existing governance board. So you may have a well-functioning governance board, but perhaps you'd like to leverage an advisory board on specific matters. In some industries, it's actually regulated that they need an advisory board. And sometimes international companies, when they put a subsidiary in another country and have a country manager, often that country manager will look to put together an advisory board to help them come up with great strategies to report back to head office. Now, I'd just like to finish perhaps talking about a case study just to kind of flesh out some of the points that I've just been through. So this is an example of a asset management services business doing roughly $20 million of turnover. They developed some internal software and they had some advice of sell the professional services, put all the money into the software, and you can flip the business for a 20 times EBIT multiple. Haven't we heard that before? Tech companies can make lots of money. Of course, there's a bit of a problem. There was no plan B, because even though the software had proven itself to be useful internally, that didn't mean it was going to be a commercial product. So I got together with the three directors who started the business and had been in business for 5 years, and we went through a process. We looked at their governance, areas they were doing well and areas they need to tighten up. Looked at some of the strategic options if the first option wasn't going to work. Then we took a deep dive into the business. Where were those strategic gaps and they perhaps could do with some help from some advisors, and then shortlisted some advisory models. As a result, we put together an advisory board. That advisory board met 4 times over a 6-month period, and the business ended up creating a subsidiary for the software business. And then the advisory board put together a charter and a scope that they would focus on. We brought in advisors with a variety of different backgrounds, some on marketing, some on IT, and some in from the client side that had used this sort of software before. So very clear what the advisory board was going to look at. They were going to provide feedback on what the new subsidiary was going to do, challenge the business owners on some of their thoughts, as well as overseeing how the new subsidiary was performing. The impact of the advisory board after that 6 months was the new subsidiary called Austmine certainly exceeded its growth targets and became self-funding. And as part of this review, the directors are also looking for a transition plan. So this fitted nicely into the transition plan, where in fact both the professional services and the software subsidiary were sold on to international software company called CoSol. One of the directors stayed on, one retired, and one has left and started a new business. So apart from hitting their financial goals, what were some of the other impacts and usefulness of the advisory board? Well, the directors certainly gained more confidence, making good decisions. They'd certainly tightened up their governance and I guess addressed some of the points that Laura made earlier. They got better clarity on some of the risks involved in the new business venture, and they also were able to put together a transition plan which gave all of the directors confidence in terms of how they would transition on from the business. So overall, just quoting Stuart Burkhardt, one of the directors, advisory board certainly gave them the confidence to do a better job on how they were going. So I hope that's given you all a good overview of the differences between an advisory board and a governance board, how you might leverage advisors into your business. There are lots of people that will call themselves advisors. Certainly for me, a good advisor and a good advisory board is independent, they're expert and they're experienced, and they'll really help lift you achieve your strategic goals. Now I'll hand it back over to Sam. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Craig. Some great insights there into the benefits, the real strong benefits to a business of having a experienced advisory board to guide them along. Look, it's now time for the Q&A. If you haven't already submitted a question, you can do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will get cracking with some that I've got that have come through already. So this one is directed at Craig. Are advisory board members remunerated the same as governance board directors?
Great question, and that's a very common question I get all the time. The simple answer is yes, they are. Now, clearly, if you're a startup or a very early stage business, cash is probably pretty tight, and you're probably going to be looking to leverage an advisor pro bono or maybe some sort of equity arrangement, which I can go into in a lot more detail. Look, I guess the deeper answer to that question is about, of course, well, how much did I remunerate them? And I think just as you would remunerate a governance board director, it's really going to come down to that advisor's expertise, their experience, and how they can contribute to your business. If I was looking, for example, a strategic advisor on coming up with an IP strategy, then I would look to what would you pay a partner of an IP firm, and whatever that daily rate would probably be the rate that you would use. So short answer is certainly they should be remunerated, no different to a governance board director.
Thank you, Craig. Let's have a look. There's another one here for you, Craig. I've heard there's a risk that an advisor can be considered a shadow director. What does this mean?
Yes, I've heard that one come up before. So I go back, Sam, to the definition I gave earlier, the very simple difference between a governance board and an advisory board. A governance board has statutory obligations to make decisions, whereas an advisory board makes recommendations only. Where an advisor can fall into a trap of a shadow director is probably in two ways, the two probably most common ways I see. The first one would be the advisor sitting in on a governance board meeting and being involved in the decision making. That would probably clearly count as a shadow director. The other way that often happens is a strategic advisor gets involved in the business. So that's either directly managing staff or perhaps managing a project or an aspect of the business. And in that case, they potentially could be exposed and could be considered a shadow director. I'd probably also defer to Laura if she would agree with that definition.
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable.
Thank you both. Another one for you, Craig. Can you detail the equity arrangement you would set up with a startup?
The $10 million question. Look, equity arrangements are quite mature in Silicon Valley. So if you're a fintech or any sort of app, startup, and you were going to take on the world and get some Silicon Valley investors in, they have a very mature structure, very clear frameworks and ways of working that out. So not a really simple answer to it. However, a couple of guidelines. First thing is, if an advisor or you're considering remunerating an advisor on an equity arrangement, it would be quite a very small percentage of the equity. And when I say small, we're talking anything from, a quarter up to 1%. So it's not going to be a big chunk of equity. Second thing is to agree on the valuation, what would be the equity's worth. And then I would bracket that over time. I'd probably only let it run for a couple of years and have a 3-month cliff. In other words, it's not going to be open-ended. If you suddenly become a $10 billion unicorn overnight, it's not like the advisor's going to make a fortune and retire. So there are some templates and there are some guidelines in place, and I'd be more than happy to talk with someone in more detail offline.
Thank you, Craig. I have another one for you, actually. Just in regards to small business METS companies, what are some of the common governance gaps you see or you come across?
Some common governance gaps, and I'll probably also defer to Laura on this. Look, I think for businesses, particularly starting out where perhaps it's just you and your co-founder, often there's just not that simple recognition that you actually are a governance board. And as such, you should be behaving as a governance board and should have some sort of formal and regular structures in place. So, for example, as Laura covered some of the risk areas, I would certainly be recommending that you would have some sort of calendar of risk review. So, for example, if you are a METS business, developing some pretty interesting IP that could be quite valuable, then that would be something you'd want to review. If you are a professional services firm with lots of staff, then you want to make sure your HR policies are being reviewed regularly. Likewise, if you're a mining contractor and sending people on site, clearly your health and safety would be policy areas that you would be looking at. The second area, and I might defer to Laura to make some comments on this as well, is really about decision making. And in particular, what are some of those key decisions that you should be documenting in case things go wrong? And in my experience, that often is around people. If you need to move somebody on, that sort of decision, my recommendation certainly would be it should be discussed at a formal board meeting and that decision noted down so that if some legal proceeding or something else happens in the future, you're at least covered. That would be sort of some of the typical gaps that I would identify. Perhaps, Laura, you could expand a little bit on some of the things owners should do.
Yeah, sure. I think sometimes owners, and particularly with the risks, they know what's going on, they know what the risks are, and sometimes it's about having a bit more structure, framework, process, because quite often things are being done, they're not always being done badly, but then having that visibility and reporting and framework is where I think things can get missed. So even things like your legislation compliance, what are the inputs you're using to make sure everything's captured, determining what's relevant, flowing that up through reporting, making that relevant to your organization. So I think sometimes just having that structure and process just allows the reporting to come up, the visibility. Sometimes a lot of things are going on, but it could just be around having that structure and framework to have, that clear oversight and management. And then, another thing we might see, if you set a risk appetite, well, how are you going to measure that? What needs to be escalated up to the board? So I guess it's having that real clear structure process, what needs to be escalated up, where do the decisions need to be, at a higher level. So I guess there's some of the things that might be worth mentioning.
I think the other thing about, even though Laura went through quite a lot of, I guess, some of the mechanics there, it never ceases to amaze me where some of the basic building blocks aren't there. And one of them is a shareholder agreement. I'm amazed. I've come across 70, $80 million turnover businesses, two guys been working together for 5 years, known each other for 20 years, and didn't have a shareholder agreement. And kind of looked at me and said, well, we trust each other. That's all good when times are good, but when things happen, and sometimes it could be as simple as, one of the business partners passes away, or one of the business partners changes in terms of their marital status. I mean, it could be just simple things like that that can have an impact. So again, when you're talking to your lawyer, you're talking to your financial accountant, someone like Laura, when they tell you get a constitution, get a shareholder agreement, get these things in place, there's a good reason for it. So one of it is about risk mitigation, but the other part of it is about growing your business. So you need to think about, particularly if you're a small growing business, when you're bringing key people into the business, and particularly if they have some equity arrangement, you need to be very clear on the basis that they come in and then the basis that they can then sell their equity, and also protecting your IP and your rights. What you don't want is a key staff member to leave and take all that good IP with them. So there's reasons that we have some of these key structures in place, not only protect yourself, but also to help you grow.
Thank you for that. Craig, what would be the percentage of interest of an advisory between established versus startup business?
So could you just rephrase that again, Sam? I'm just trying to pick the question up.
So what would the percentage of interest of an advisory be between an established and a startup business?
Okay, is that percentage remuneration, or I'm just having a little trouble understanding the question?
Yeah, it's an audience member question.
Yeah, maybe if they could just clarify what they mean by that. whether they mean remuneration or the percentage of businesses that have an advisory board. If I take the latter one, advisory boards are becoming a more common structure, and probably a couple of reasons for that. Certainly at the startup stage, very useful. A lot of businesses will like to get advisors around them. It helps them not only grow and answer some of those strategic questions, but when they're looking for funding, whether that's private funding or going public, those advisors can be very useful. There's also another, I guess, risk out there, which is Australia is a very over-regulated sector in terms of what's required as a board director, far more onerous compared to other jurisdictions around the world. And the risk profile of directors has gone up significantly in the last few years. In fact, there's a lot of directors that would be what I call serial directors. They would sit on 4 or 5 boards that just simply don't do it anymore because their risk profile and their potential liability is quite high. So often an advisory board is quite attractive for them. So it leaves you as the business owners still making decisions, controlling the governance structure, but allows you to get those great people in that you may not, or they may not want to join your governance board, but can be on an advisory board. So certainly the frequency incidence of advisory boards is increasing.
All right, that looks like.
And yeah, and sorry, now that I can see the question in the chat there, between established and startups, what would be the percentage? I look, I don't think there's a great big difference. Probably the only difference I would say with startups is the advisory boards, perhaps remuneration more on the pro bono side is probably short-lived. It's really a bit of a sugar hit to get them to grow. In terms of established businesses, as I said, it's starting to become more and more a common structure.
Right. Thank you, Craig. That appears to be all the questions we have. So look, if you didn't get time to think of a question, reach out to us at Austmine and we will put you in touch directly with the respective presenter. Look, that concludes our professional services webinar today. I'd like to give a big thank you to Laura and Craig for sharing their expertise with us today. Thank you to everyone who attended. As mentioned, we will have a recording of this sent to all the participants, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next Austmine webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you.